Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second China lecture at the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. We are delighted to have Jack Perkowski as our speaker tonight. Jack has had an illustrious career, and I was looking back at all the things that he's done, and I saw at least 3 different careers that he's had. First was a very traditional career. He went to Yale, played football, one of the best teams that played football at Yale, and then went to Harvard Business School, got his MBA with distinction, and then went off to Wall Street and had a very successful career on Wall Street working for Bain Capital. He rose to be the head of their investment banking. And then I don't know what happened, he got a bug and he decided he had to go to Asia. He had to move to that part of the world and do something totally different. And he spent more than 25 years after that looking at opportunities to start new businesses in that part of the world. And so that's the second career as an entrepreneur. And not an entrepreneur in the US, but an entrepreneur in China. He didn't speak the language, he didn't know the region, he had no real roots in that part of the world, but he did it anyway. And he ended up building a very successful auto parts company that I believe supplies maybe 25% of the parts of any diesel engine that you see being used in China. The company had 17 factories across the heartland of the country. It was a very successful enterprise. He ran it for 15 years. And then he began, I would say the third career, which was as an author, speaker, advisor. And he wrote this book, Managing the Dragon, which is a lot of fun to read. I was rereading parts of it last night, Jack, and it's still every bit as interesting as it was when you first wrote the book. And having spent all that time in China, he's decided to continue to operate in China, and he's been serving as an advisor to companies in China and US companies looking to enter that part of the world. Commenting on this book, Tom Brokaw, for those of you who remember the famous anchor at NBC News, said, if you want to do business in China, Jack Perkowski is your man. He shows you the way with insight, humor, and practical advice. That's what I think is in store for us this evening: insight, humor, and practical advice. So, real pleasure, Jack, to have you. Thank you for doing this. And just before I turn it over to you, let me remind everyone, again, please turn up your mics. If you have questions for Jack, please post them in the chat. Jack will probably speak for 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A. As I said, if your questions, as they keep popping up in your heads, please keep posting them on chat, and we will get to them in about 25 or 30 minutes. With that, I want to turn over to Jack. Jack, welcome virtually to Northeastern, to the Center for Emerging Markets.
Thank you very much, Robbie, for that introduction. I've enjoyed my association with you over the years and with the Center for Emerging Markets, and I'm very pleased to be with all of you this evening. I'll try to provide insights. Can't promise any humor, but we'll see how it goes. A number of years ago, I was asked to go on a 3-city speaking tour that began in Sydney, Australia, moved on to Melbourne, and then finished up in Auckland, New Zealand. In each city, we spoke to about 500 to 600 global or corporate and government leaders. In each of the 3 cities, we had the same 4 speakers. And my job was the same. I was the leadoff hitter, and I was supposed to talk about China. Following me was President Bill Clinton. Following President Clinton was Carly Fiorina, who ran Hewlett-Packard and also was a presidential candidate. And then following Carly was Michael Eisner, who built Disney to what it is today. It was pretty much of an all-star cast that I was privileged to be part of. Now, because I went to China in an unusual way, as I'll explain in a minute, I get called on a lot during the course of the year to speak to various groups. And because I do it a lot, I don't tend to get very nervous. However, you can bet in the run up to Sydney, I was getting plenty nervous because whatever you think of as politics, Bill Clinton is arguably one of the best communicators of all time. And I was supposed to lead off for him. My wife, Carlene, who has been with me in my entire 30-year journey through Asia and has worked at every company that I've started, at the time was head of corporate communications at ASIMCO, the auto components company that I started. And as the head of corporate communications, she dealt with the press. And she could see that as the days were going on, she could see me getting more and more nervous. And like any good wife, she tried to calm me down. And she said, Jack, the absolute best position to be in is to be speaking right before President Clinton, because all the media is going to want to be in their seats to hear the beginning of his presentation. That just made me more nervous because that meant that not only those 500 or 600 business and government leaders were going to be in the audience, but also all the media. So I had to think of a way to break the ice. And so I told the group in Sydney that when I was born, my parents thought long and hard of what to name me. They gave me the name Jack. When I went to China, the very first thing the Chinese did was give me a Chinese name. And I told them that I'd only been in Australia for 3 days and I had a new first name, Who Is? Because for 3 days, people were looking at the agenda and saying, I know who Bill Clinton is, I know who Carly Fiorina is, and I know who Michael Eisner is, but who is Jack Perkowski? So I thought what I'd do today, and Robbie did a good job of really kind of sketching out my 3 careers, as he called them. Let me maybe fill in a little bit of details and also maybe give you some of the thinking behind my, what I was going through. I was born in Pittsburgh and then went on to Yale University. And in addition to what I did in the classroom, I played on one of the best Yale football teams of all time. In fact, our final game against Harvard in 1968 was called by Sports Illustrated one of the 5 most memorable college football games of all times. In fact, it was so memorable, they made a movie out of it, a documentary that starred the players. So I was in it. Tommy Lee Jones was in it. He was a guard for Harvard. He was rooming with Al Gore. Our tackle was rooming with George Bush. And our fullback was dating Meryl Streep. Now, I know for the younger people in the audience, maybe these names don't mean anything, but I'm sure Robbie and others will recognize all those names. It was a pretty interesting group. I then went on to Harvard Business School. And when I graduated in 1973, I went to work on Wall Street for a company called Paine Webber, which is now part of UBS. And I went into the investment banking department. And for the next 20 years, I did all the things that investment bankers do. I did private placements, I did M&A, public offerings, I ran the real estate group. And my last job was running the entire investment banking operation. So by age 40 in 1990, I had what most people would consider a pretty good first career. But as Robbie mentioned, it wasn't really enough. I wanted to do something for a second career. And I got it in my head that what I wanted to do is that I wanted to identify a trend and do something to get out ahead of that trend. So I wanted to be a pioneer. It frankly could have been any industry, any part of the world. It didn't make any difference. The only qualification was it had to be a long-term trend. Because I said, whatever it is I do next, I want to do it for the rest of my working career. And that's what got me onto Asia. In the course of my due diligence, if you will, I stumbled upon a very fundamental demographic, which is half of the world's population lives in Asia, and the average age is in the low 20s. I have 3 grown children, so I know that young people spend money. They fall in love, they get married, they buy an apartment, they furnish it, they buy a house, they buy a car, and so forth. So I felt that as the large young populations of Asia started to spend money, that the development of Asia could be a very important trend in the 21st century. So that got me interested in Asia. And at that time, Asia really, Hong Kong really represented the epitome of Asia. So I sort of started traveling back and forth to Hong Kong. And I ended up moving there in 1991. And to be honest, I had no idea what I was going to do, where I was going to do it, or how I was going to do it, but I figured that I was kind of in the middle of something that could be very interesting. I talked to the overseas Chinese businessmen in Hong Kong, and they would spend 5 minutes talking about their very big business in Hong Kong and 25 minutes talking about what they were trying to do in China. So I felt that if the smartest, most knowledgeable people in the region were going to China, then I didn't need to do any more research. So that's how I narrowed down Asia to China. I made my first trip in August of 1992, and I started traveling around. I got interested in China's auto industry, not because I had any experience in autos, I didn't, and not because China had a large auto industry. Frankly, at that time, China was only making 500,000 vehicles a year. But the nice thing about China is they tell you what they want to do. They give you a 5-year plan. And in China's 5-year plan at the time was to develop its auto industry. And one of the ways they wanted to do that was to make it attractive for component suppliers to come to China, because they knew that you couldn't make good vehicles unless you had good quality parts. So in order to do that, they passed a policy in 1993 that essentially said that foreign investors in auto components could have majority ownership. Now today, you can, as a foreigner, you can own majority, you could own 100% in virtually every industry in China. However, in 1993, the only industry where you could have majority, forget about owning 100%, was in auto components. And that was important to me because I felt that in order to really create a company in China, or develop a company in China with what was on the ground, it was going to have to change. And I had to have the ability to do that. So I developed a strategy for in effect, doing a roll-up of China's auto components industry. And the idea was to acquire majority ownership in about a dozen leading factories, put them under one umbrella to get the economies of scale and marketing, and then to put in common management and quality systems to improve the company. So that was the strategy. Now, of course, you need to test that out in practice. And so in January of 93, I recruited 2 people to work for me. One was a British accountant that spoke Chinese. Another was a Chinese national. And the 3 of us in the first 9 months of 1993 visited over 100 factories in 40 cities all over China. You name the factory or the province or the city, and we were there. During that 9 months, I ate every part of every animal. During that 9 months, I also drank more baijiu than any human being should drink in a lifetime. And for those of you that are familiar with China, they have a drink called baijiu, which is a rice wine, which is clear, looks like water, but tastes and smells like kerosene. And it's very, very strong. And basically, everybody in China wanted to show me a good time because unlike today where China has a lot of capital, in 1993, there was no capital in China. I think Chinese government had $26 billion of foreign currency reserves. That was it. The government didn't have money, companies didn't have money, people didn't have money. And I was, of 1.3 billion people, I was the only person in China who had ever been on Wall Street, let alone worked 20 years there. So when they heard that I was going around China saying that I might bring capital management and technology to their factory, to their city, they wanted me to come visit. And when I came to visit, they wanted to show us a good time. So that's how I spent the first 9 months in 1993. At the end of that, I figured I'd better go back and get some real capital before my liver gave out. And I then went back to my friends on Wall Street. We raised $150 million as the first round. And I founded ASIMCO Technologies in February of 1994. About 18 months later, we raised another $150 million. So at a time when China was at a very early stage of its development of the auto industry, we invested $300 million. And we did more than that. We brought in technology partners. We also discovered very early that the only way that you could be successful in China is to build and to develop and to empower, most importantly, a good local management team. So we became known for our ability to really train Chinese managers. And we were 3 times named one of the 10 best employers in China. These were surveys done by the Wall Street Journal and so forth. And in 2008, on the occasion of 30 years of China opening up, basically China Auto News named me one of the 30 outstanding entrepreneurs in China's auto components industry, not just for 1 year, but for the whole 30 years. And I was the only foreigner on that list. So that kind of showed me that the Chinese considered ASIMCO, even though it was founded by a Westerner, funded with Western capital, they considered it a Chinese company, which is another piece of advice that I give to companies. And then along the way, I wrote the book that Robbie mentioned. And even though it was written in 2008, trust me, a lot of the lessons that we learned there are still very applicable today. Because even though China's changed a lot since I first went there, there are certain things of China that haven't changed. And a lot of the topics in the book really cover those things that are still very much at force or at work in China. Okay, why do I tell you all of this? Well, I want you to understand I'm not an economist. I'm not a sinologist. I was an American studies major at Yale, not a Chinese studies major. Basically, what I'm going to talk about as far as my observations about where China's headed and about what the relationship with the US might look like, it's all based on 30 years of living, working, and doing business in the country and trying to piece together what I was seeing on the ground and factoring it into kind of an overall framework. Okay, the question that I've been asked to address is, what's the future of the Sino-US relationship? Well, before you even begin to try to make a projection, you need to understand that China 2022 is fundamentally different than China 1978 to 2020. And until you understand that and realize that you need to recalibrate your thinking on China, that I don't think you can really make a realistic prediction in today. So what do I mean by that? Well, I sent around a PowerPoint, which I think some of you should have gotten, and I tried to lay out kind of the theme. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I would encourage you to go back to it after the presentation, because there's a lot of good information in there, and it kind of gives the background for what I'm about to say. But basically, what's happened is that China's success has meant that the country has transitioned from a country that was very insecure and very uncertain as to its future role in the world to one that is very confident about its role in the world and has a confidence that I would say borders on arrogance. And I think you need to understand that to then understand how things are going to play out. Now, let me go back and give you a little bit of background. When I look at modern China, I think there are three watershed events. The first one was 1949, when Mao Zedong basically founded the PRC and united China. And he was the second person to do that. The first one was Emperor Qin 2,000 years before. And Chairman Mao has a special place in Chinese history because he did unify the country. However, along with the foundation of the country, he also kept the country closed from the outside world. So from 1949 until 1978, basically China was frozen in time at a time when the United States, Europe, Japan, other countries were developing both economically and technologically. Until Mao died in 1976, and then Deng Xiaoping took over as the paramount leader. And he then started the second watershed event, which is when he opened up. Basically, when Deng Xiaoping took over China, it was a mess. People were starving, literally dying of hunger. The country couldn't feed itself. They had no capital to really develop their industries. And Deng Xiaoping quite realistically felt that there was no way that the Chinese on their own could climb this very high wall of technology that had been erected in the West without getting help from the West. And so he opened the doors to China to Western capital management and technology. First went to the overseas Chinese in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and then later the European and the US and other companies followed. So when I came along in 1993, China had already had a 15-year track record of this open door policy. And so that, and frankly, that's what gave me encouragement, even though it was a very early stage, that's what encouraged me to basically continue to work in China. Now, following Deng Xiaoping, all of the leaders since then, Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji, Hu Jintao, and even President Xi in his first term, more or less followed this open door policy, welcoming the West, Western capital management and technology. And that then led to the third watershed event, which was 2001, when China joined WTO. If you look at China's development over the last 40 years, you see that everything spikes up in 2001 when China entered the World Trade Organization. So when China entered, its GDP was 1 trillion. It then, till 2020, grew to 14 trillion. Per capita income was under $1,000 per person. It's now over 11,000. Auto production went from 2 million vehicles a year to 25 million. Steel production went from 100 million tons to 1 billion tons. And with all of that success in developing its industry, its export programs, and so forth, the capital in China grew quite substantially. So today there's about $33 trillion of capital on deposit in Chinese banks. And China's also developed their own stock markets in Shenzhen and in Shanghai. So this, the entrance into WTO brought a tremendous amount of economic success. And with that economic success, China then transitioned from being a country that was very insecure about its future to one that is very confident about its future and has more recently displayed, kind of aggressive actions, okay? Now, Xi Jinping, for whatever reason, in his first term, he more or less followed the policies of the previous leaders. Whatever caused him to change, I don't know. He did, when he first got in, he did get into an anti-corruption campaign. A lot of people thought that was, yes, anti-corruption, but was also getting rid of all of his competitors and so forth. Who knows, okay? But the point is, if you take that history and then you combine it with the recent actions that have been taken by China, you can see that China's behaving very differently than it has in the past. First of all, during the entire from 2000 to 2020-21, China had numerous IP violations, intellectual property. Nobody really challenged China. And so those IP violations still continue. China launched under Xi Jinping a Made in China 2025 initiative. This is basically says that China by 2025 wants to be the global leader in all key technologies. Everything from electric vehicles to materials technology to advanced manufacturing, direct threat to the Western global leaders. China also developed its Belt and Road Initiative, which was really a way to use its influence, its capital, its technology to really gather around it 68 other countries to be, allies, client states, whatever you want to call them. China's cracked down on technology, particularly anything that it gathers data from the Chinese citizens and with the danger that it might be exported to somewhere else. That crackdown, for example, cost Didi $60 billion. When they did their IPO, they came out at an $80 billion valuation. The stock is now trading at $20 billion. So it's really kind of killed Western capital as far as some of these technology companies. A lot of people think that China's behavior was reckless towards the rest of the world with this whole pandemic. And when poor Australia, basically said that they should, or an international committee should be convened to look at the origins of COVID, China really, came down very heavily on Australia and really banned most of their exports. And China was one of their biggest trading partners. When demonstrators started demonstrating in Hong Kong, China came down pretty hard and in effect cut short by half the 50-year agreement it had in place with the UK. And we've seen what China's been doing in the South China Sea and Taiwan. So I would argue that it's pretty easy to predict what China's going to do. Basically, China's going to continue under Xi Jinping, is going to continue to push the envelope economically, trade-wise, politically, and so forth. So the $64,000 question then becomes, what will the West do? How will they react to this? And when I say the West, I'm really talking about the United States, because the United States is arguably the only country in the world that really is big enough to really stand up and confront China. So what will the West, the US do? Well, there are two ways that the US can react to this. Number one is to confront China and do what Deng Xiaoping, in that presentation I sent you, there's a quote from Deng Xiaoping that basically says that if China should ever get to the point where it's being aggressive towards its neighbors, that the Chinese people and other nations should confront China. Okay, so that was his advice. So the one approach is to confront China. Now, if the United States does that, then the relationship is going to be rocky, okay? But the upside to that is there's some chance of preserving some semblance of today's world order. The second approach is what I call the go along to get along approach. And the advantage of that is that means that the relationship between the two governments will be relatively smooth, but what that means is that the world economic and political order is going to change over the next number of years away from the United States and towards China. Whether that's good or bad is something that everybody has to decide. So I think when you try to chart out what the relationship between the US and China is going to be, you need to answer the question of how will the US react? And everybody can make their own judgment. The most important issue is for CEOs. And we're basically, what does a CEO supposed to do? And this really puts CEOs in a very difficult position, because on the one hand, China remains the second largest economy in the world, and arguably the largest and fastest growing consumer market. So if you're the CEO of a company that has some type of global leadership position, and you're in the United States, if you completely opt out of China, then what does that mean for 20 years from now? Are you going to still be a global leader 20 years from now? So opting out of China is not really a great option. The second is to try to engage with China. And that just means that you need to go in with your eyes open and to understand how China is different from what it was 20 years ago and what you need to do to react to that. So I would say that the good news in all that is that the solution for both, for doing business in China today is the same as it was when I went to China. You need to develop good local managers. So when I went to China, our biggest issue was finding good managements. And so developing a local management team was something that we did to counteract that. We're working with a company today that needs to replace its China manager. Within a couple of weeks, we surfaced 3 candidates, really great candidates. The great experience, good educations, good experience, on-point experience. Whichever one of those candidates the company picks, I'm sure they'll do well. I didn't have that luxury 20 years ago. Okay, we had a hard time finding just one manager. So that management problem now is no longer the key problem. The key problem today is really dealing with the government. And dealing with the government in some sense has always been an issue in China. Although when we were doing, basically the ASIMCO, we learned how to deal with the local governments, and that's still very important. But I think what's equally important now is to be very cognizant and very sensitive to what the central government, is doing or which direction it's going, and to make sure that what you're doing as a business doesn't collide with that in some way. And when you look at what China's doing from a Western perspective, you might come to one conclusion. But when you have somebody that, that basically grew up in the country, understands the country, they might come from a completely different idea or conclusion about what the government's doing. So that's why I say that just like it was when I started at ASIMCO, it's important today to have good local managers that will be sensitive. Now, China has suffered a lot reputationally because of COVID. In that presentation, I gave you some surveys about how people feel about China, and clearly people feel a lot differently about China today than they did 20 years ago. And I think the Olympic athletes got a little taste of what it's like to live in China when they were quarantined and that sort of thing. So from a reputational point of view, China suffered a lot. There was a lot of speculation when COVID hit that basically supply chains were going to leave China. That really hasn't happened. In fact, China's exports last year were up 30% overall to the record numbers. China's exports to the United States were up 16% to the United States in 2021. So there's really no evidence that supply chains have left. In some of those surveys that I sent, only a small number of companies are now saying they're going to decrease their involvement in China. People companies still realize that China's their biggest single growth opportunity. Okay, so so some of the predictions about what was going to happen as far as doing business in China, really haven't come to fruition. Now, from our own point of view, we still see companies that aren't in China today that want to engage with China in some ways. So I don't really see any lessening of interest or activity. However, again, I go back to, China's always been difficult. In 1993, when I started in China, it was difficult because, the lack of management resources. Today, it's difficult, but it's difficult for a different reason because of the things that the government's doing. So let me stop there, and I'd be happy to answer any and all questions.
Thanks, Jack. Let me start with the question from Mariella, I think, asking about how did you train the managers that you hired back in the days of ASIMCO, and did you have to somehow adjust what the training programs to fit the Chinese context, or were you doing things that you would do any place?
Well, we learned a lot in terms of how we developed our managers. The first thing we did is we eliminated the requirement they speak English. If you think about it, now, it's not maybe so much today, but I think still people, don't quite appreciate the fact that you take a China, somebody who grew up in China, they may speak what sounds like perfect English. But I had one of my managers tell me, a guy that went to Tsinghua, very well educated, speaks English. If he was there, you'd say, wow, great English. He told me, Jack, if I'm in a room with a half a dozen Americans, he said, I get about 70% of what they're saying. Okay. So even somebody that supposedly has good language capability is only getting partial. Now, okay, you go back 20 years, basically a lot fewer people had English capability. Now, if you restrict your management universe that you look to only English speakers, you're only getting one tiny part of the of the universe. And what we wanted to do is really draw from the broadest universe. So the first way is to pick them, right? And if I put two Chinese in front of you, one speaks fluent English, another one doesn't speak a word of English, but the one that doesn't speak a word is a much better manager. I guarantee you, a Western manager will always pick the one that speaks English. Okay, so basically we kind of broadened our universe. We then learned that in terms of training, the things that worked in the United States, I mean, we did all the kind of normal things you do about team building and so forth. I was kind of a little suspicious at first that, they might think this is kind of hokey, but the Chinese really liked it. And so the things that worked in the United States, we found worked in China. The one big difference was the Chinese really appreciated learning by doing, or they wanted, rather than sitting in a classroom and being told theoretically how to do something, they really wanted whoever was teaching to roll up their sleeves, go with them out on the factory floor and really show them how to do it. So the learning by doing was extremely important. And then we put them in positions of responsibility. I mean, basically, we gave them opportunity, and we didn't micromanage them. I always say, I got 3 grown children. I say the scariest part in a father's life is when the kid turns 16 or 17 and gets their driver's license, because the first Saturday night, they're going to come to you and they're going to ask for the keys to the car. And you're going to think about all the bad things that can happen, but you reach in, you say, okay, train, educate him to be him or her to be a responsible adult. You turn over the keys. Well, you need to turn over the keys to your Chinese managers. And I found when you put that level of trust in them and let them go out and do it, they learned a lot just by doing. And then we had the other thing we did that was probably the best thing we did was we had quarterly general managers meetings. And so we would meet in a different factory location. And we had 18 operating units. We had 12,000 employees around the country. And so when we were implementing, lean manufacturing or Six Sigma or any of these kind of programs, we would have the general managers meeting at a different location. And we would typically have about 50 people. Usually the general manager and 1 or 2 of his key deputies would come to these meetings. And basically they would learn from what the other companies were doing. And of course, if you were a manager of a factory where the general manager's meeting was going to be at your factory, boy, you really had that thing spruced up. And so everybody learned a lot just by learning from each other. And those are some of the things we learned. There's a whole chapter in the book about how we developed our Chinese managers. So that only covers some of them, but those are some of the key points.
You said if the manager doesn't speak English and I think you don't speak Chinese, are you working through translators? Does that work well enough?
So I had a guy named Henry Wong. Henry Wong is fantastic. He's a kind of person, I don't care whether you're Chinese, American, Japanese, Korean, you can't help but like Henry. And Henry kind of spent a couple of years in the States. He was kind of a linguistics major, and so he spoke very good English. But more importantly, Henry watched even when he was only in the States for two years. When he went back to back to China, he still watches like all the U.S. movies, all the TV series, and so forth. So he gets not only the language but also all of the various idioms and other phrases that we use. So he really has a pretty good understanding. And so Henry, he worked with me, and every important meeting I had with general managers, with the local governments, with our Chinese partners, from the time he joined us in the late 90s, Henry was there. And Henry understood what I was saying. The general managers knew that Henry was going to convey exactly what I was saying. He wasn't going to, embellish it or not say things. He was going to give it to them straight. And I knew that Henry was going to tell me. So with our general managers that didn't speak, and we had 18 operating units, I would say about half of them had some language capability, but the other half spoke not a word of English. So I was relying on Henry with all of them, but most importantly, with those managers that didn't speak English to really adequately communicate. So it takes a little bit longer, but one of the biggest problems, the biggest causes for problems in China is miscommunication. So if that's one of the biggest causes, it doesn't hurt to take a little extra time and make sure that the communications are correct. And so it took a little bit longer, but that was really an effective way for me to communicate with the general managers. That was frankly more effective than me trying to learn Chinese and speak to them in Chinese.
Right. My colleague George Yip has a question about how should a Western company decide how much IP to bring to China?
How much IP? So this is the biggest. That's the biggest issue when companies want to bring their product in some way to China or have it manufactured in China. Intellectual property is one of the big issues, and that it really depends a lot on the type of product it is. how the product's manufactured or developed, and so forth. I mean, obviously, that's something you need to be extremely careful about, but you also need to understand that if you've got a great product and you don't bring it to China, if it's such a great product, eventually somebody's going to find it, and they're going to figure out a way to backward engineer it or whatever. If you're making a part, and that's maybe the simplest thing, software is a little bit more difficult, but if you're making a part, somebody can buy the part in the United States, take it back to China, and reverse engineer it, okay? So you need to understand that if you don't go to China, then you're facing even a bigger risk. You're gonna get your product manufactured in China. It may not be as good, but it's gonna be cheaper, all right? So, that's kind of what you need to do. But depending on the product, maybe there's some processes you don't bring to China. Maybe you split up the processes. You don't do it all in one factory. So there are different ways that you can address it, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that IP isn't a big issue. It's a very, very big issue, and it's one that needs to be thought about. And how much you bring, it's really a function of the product.
Kate is asking whether you think the movement of companies out of China, which you say hasn't happened to any large extent up to this time, might increase in the next 3 to 5 years. And if so, which types of companies are more susceptible to moving?
I mean, I think, and I'm not going to say they're going to move out of China, because I think that if you look at why it hasn't happened, yes, there are other countries around Southeast Asia, but they're relatively small compared to China. So even like Vietnam has 80 million people? That's a lot of people, but that's one province in China. And so basically, how much can you really move out before you really start to impact all of the input costs, labor, land, factory buildings, all this sort of thing. So, there are restrictions to what you can move. Now, some companies are doing that. They are diversifying and setting up maybe a factory in China. I think what's more likely to happen is that countries and companies are going to get more realistic about having a key part of their supply base in their home country. So, for example, I would see in medical products, basically where medical companies can say, wait a minute, we can't really afford to be completely dependent upon China for all the reasons that we're well aware of. So maybe we spend more time setting up manufacturing in the United States. Doesn't mean we stop manufacturing in China, doesn't mean we move it out, just means that we're going to build up a US or wherever your home country is. Same thing now, we're going through the same thing now with batteries. Everybody's pushing electric vehicles. Well, China accounts for about half of the global production electric batteries, with Korea and Japan counting for most of the rest of it. There's really no US company other than Tesla, which really makes its own batteries. So this is a really key issue. Now there's a big push to build and we're involved in a project which is basically building a battery ecosystem, an 800-acre project, which will include cell manufacturers as well as the key elements of the supply chain or the value chain. So I think what you're going to see is not so much companies moving out of China as much as they are focusing maybe future development of manufacturing capacity in their home country to at least balance the supply chain.
Dave Nardone, I think,
Yep.
says, as you started a local company, presumably also sold products, also sold international brands as some of the component makers. How did you acquire the technology? And did your Western partners, did you partner? Sorry, I can't follow the last part of the question, but I think the basic question is, how did you get the technology and how did the Western companies feel about sharing their technology into those ventures?
Okay, we actually did that a couple ways. And, we were, even though we were a completely Chinese company, I mean, basically 99.9% of our 12,000 employees were Chinese. I was one of the few Westerners by the time we were all finished. But yet, we operated according to international principles, and companies recognized that. In fact, I had one representative from a company that came to our office. It goes for everything from the way you do your business to your brochures to your offices. I had one Western representative come to my office. He sat in our conference room. He had been traveling around China, and he looked around. He said, "I really feel at home." He felt like he was at his home office because we had it decked up. We had it decorated and fitted out. I mean, not ostentatious, but very Western oriented. So they felt comfortable dealing with us, and so actually they felt more comfortable doing something with us than they might with a company that didn't have our background. So we did various types of joint ventures and technology agreements for Caterpillar, Cummins, Bosch, and Delco Ramy, and so forth, where we actually partnered. We were a JV partner. They transferred in technology, and we manufactured their product according to their specifications, and in many cases under their brand name. Okay, so that was one way. The other way we did it is by basically exporting to them. And none of the factories that we acquired had ever exported anywhere. They were basically serving the Chinese market. And I developed the export business not because I needed another market. I mean, the China market was plenty big, but I knew before Bosch, Caterpillar, Cummins, or any of those companies give you an order, they send 10 engineers to your factory and they crawl all over it. And they spend 2 days and they give you a list of 20 things you need to do. And then they come back a month later and check to see if you've done them. Well, if you do that over a period of time with companies like Bosch, Caterpillar, and so forth, guess what? They're transferring know-how, technology, and your factories are getting better. That was another way we trained our managers. We basically leveraged the supplier development teams from these international companies to help develop our companies. We were Ford's first Q1 supplier in China. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of showed you how, we worked very effectively with these international companies. So we got it in a number of different ways, but that was always the big issue. How do you get technology?
There's a question here about how are foreign businesses these days dealing with abrupt unilateral changes in government policy?
Well, usually, I'm not saying, I'm sure there have been cases where it's been abrupt, but usually when the central government is basically contemplating some change, usually they send, they use the universities, the professors, they'll usually put out some kind of a white paper. They'll have the various industry participants that will comment on it. So these things tend to get telegraphed ahead of time. And again, if you're a Westerner doing, operating in China, and, you may not be aware of all those things that are going on. But I guarantee if you have a Chinese manager that's experienced in the industry, they're going to be aware of these things. So I'm not going to say that they never make abrupt changes, but I think that I found that when there were changes, that basically they were telegraphed well in advance, so you knew they were coming. Now, so the best way again is with the local management teams. The other thing we found is that again, developing the relationship with the local government, and all things are local in China. Basically, if you're in a city or a town, you're very important to that city as far as not only employment, but also investment you bring, exports, and all this sort of thing. And if you work it the right way, basically you can really have those local governments become some of your biggest allies. And that's what we learned how to do. And that was kind of one of the other big lessons we learned, how to work effectively with them. And so those kinds of relationships can help buffer, to the extent that there are abrupt changes, they can help to buffer that.
You've set up several factories across China, and I think some of them were in second, third, or fourth tier cities because the costs were lower in those locations. But you're making products that require some skills. It's not unskilled work, it's semi-skilled or even more than that. In many emerging markets, it's hard to develop that workforce. And I'm not talking the managerial group, but actually the shop floor workforce. How did that scale up so well across the board in so many businesses in China?
We found that, well, first of all, a large percentage, I can't say which percentage, but 60, 70% of the people, the managers in China are engineers. And that's really across the country. And that engineering skill, talent, capability is not limited to Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou. It's really spread throughout the country. In fact, I would say that in many cases, when you go to these tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities, you're going to find every bit as good of engineering talent. The other advantage is that in most cases, in most of our cases, we were the most important factory or company in that city. So working for our company was something that everybody aspired to, and you never left. So we had virtually very little turnover, both at the factory level, but also at the managerial level. Whereas if you're in a Shanghai or Beijing, basically you're going to have a lot more turnover. So, we found that the engineering talent, the workers, the workers in China, I found to be very hardworking and productive and so forth. It was really just all in the way they were managed. And, we found that was relatively uniform across the country, and that we didn't really suffer because we were in a tier 3 or tier 4 city. In fact, in many ways, I could argue that was an advantage. And, quite rightly, you had the cost advantages. Obviously, the costs are much lower when you get outside of the Beijings and the Shanghais of the world.
We have just a few minutes left, Jack. There are a couple of questions coming up on the situation in Ukraine and what this new axis developing between Putin and Xi Jinping in China and Russia portends for business and more broadly for the global economy. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about it because I knew the question would come up, but I'm also very interested in it. I think, look, when I talked about what Xi's doing, that he has his designs on Taiwan. Okay, I think it's really more a question of when, not whether. 4 years ago, I think it was, that the Chinese Congress basically eliminated the term limits on the presidency. So he's up for a third term in October. And my guess is he'll get it. My guess is he's not going to do anything before that. It's a question of what he does after that. I think he's going to watch very closely how this plays out between Russia and the rest of the world. If it looks like Russia pays a heavy cost for doing what they're doing, whether it's through sanctions or being isolated from the global community, that's going to be one, one factor. If they don't seem to have paid any cost for it, that will probably embolden them. And remember when I went back and I said that Mao has a special place in history because he united China? Well, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but my guess is that Xi would like to have as part of his legacy the fact that he was the leader that once again united China, so that he would be the third one in those history books. I don't know. The relationship between China and Russia, that hasn't really been very smooth over the years. Russia has taken land from the Chinese. They took in the 1860s. They took an area the size of larger than the state of Texas. They're still fighting over Vladivostok. That basically China claims that should be a Chinese city. So there have been disputes like that. They had a shooting war in the 80s. Ukraine is part of the Belt Road, and I think that China, the biggest trading partner with Ukraine is China. So I think it's not as clear. I don't think that any prediction that says that these two are going to be locked arm in arm going forward, I'm not sure that's quite there, because there's been a lot of acrimony between them in the past.
Are you sensing that because of the US-China trade war that US companies are finding it harder to operate in China?
No, I think, I mean, they found it harder in the sense that, I mean, maybe they, it was more expensive to source from China, and therefore, maybe they had to adjust what they were offering to the, and it really depends on the product. I mean, some products maybe you can move to Thailand. Other products can only be made in China because, in a lot of products, you need a big infrastructure or investment in forgings, castings, machining, and you can't easily replicate that. So in those cases, they could pass it along to their customers. So from that sense, I think it was harder, but I didn't really see any difference in the way the Chinese looked at US companies as a result of that trade war.
Well, we have just about another minute left. Any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
Well, most of the times I'm really painted as, people say I've got a bias. I've spent 25, 30 years doing China. I'm frankly positive. And the biggest reason for my positivity towards China are the Chinese people. When I was traveling around China, we went through some of these places in the mountains where frankly no foreigner had ever been. And in every one of these places, we'd drive through these villages and you would see people that you knew were dirt poor. But nowhere did I see a sign of despair. Basically, wherever we went, they were working, they were carrying vegetables to market, they were carrying bricks to build things or whatever. And I thought to myself that basically, if you got a billion people that in the face of such adversity can still have such a positive attitude and work hard, you don't really want to bet against the country. And it's really the faith and the confidence in the Chinese people that has really kept me in China all these years. I mean, look, with the governments, governments in any country, they have their, they all have their problems, okay? But it's really the people. I found the people to be, hardworking, positive, friendly, like Americans, and so forth. And so, that's still there today, regardless of what's going on in the Ukraine or with Xi Jinping or whatever.
Well, thank you. On that hopeful note, I think let us close this session. I want to thank you, Jack, for your insights. You've spoken to our executive MBAs every time I brought them to China for 10 years, every time, and it was always a high point of their trip. Thank you for sharing your insights, and for some of you who are going to reconnect in a few minutes, don't forget to use a different Zoom link from Canvas. I'd like to thank Sandrine Malay and Kirti Jaju, who helped put all of this together, and thank our audience, as usual, for showing up and participating with your questions. We have more events coming up. Please look out for them in your emails. We hope to see many of you back in our future events. Jack,
Great. Thank you very much, Robbie. I enjoyed it. That was helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you.